Hey,
Oh,
we're beginning recording.
calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
Yes, I am. Yes. Well, actually, no, I'm not. But
No, right. You're not.
no.
We're not here.
Where are we actually? Oh, I know
I'm
where you are.
I'm in Key West,
Yeah, you
and I'm
bastard.
getting a little hot.
I can tell you. Yeah, so you look like just telling me that you're in Key West. Your face looks redder on the screen. Is that
Yeah, I
a
think
little bit
that's
too much sun?
yeah, possibly. And you're in a sunny place, yes?
I'm
No?
braving the snow, ice, and cold to bring the story of America's bravest on the 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge,
Break my
while
heart.
you are just like sipping Mai Tais on the beach. But hey,
Break my heart.
I'm not jealous at all.
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, where Chris is on the couch and talking about some of the issues that he has. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping us bring you this show and for sending us out to all these great places. They didn't send me to Key West. That's on my own. But check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, listening on the HHH podcast. We're glad you're here. Today, we're going to present an encore episode about the Rangers in the Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of Hill 400. You've been to Hill 400
many times.
I've been there as well. Pretty cool place.
It's interesting because Len Lamel, who looms pretty large in that book and in the Pointe Du Hoc story, told me on several occasions. He said, Chris, that compared to Hill 400, D-Day was a training exercise. And on another occasion, he said Hill 400 was his longest day. So
Wow. So hopefully that'll be an interesting show for people. Guys, let us know that you're here, that you're out there, and what you're drinking. And while you're doing that, Chris, I'll mention that I want to thank everybody, as I'm sure you do as well, who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can join this group by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour and making your donation. So yeah, you can become part of the few
the proud
who support us. Not that few, this few.
This few,
okay. All right, but before I get into trouble, why don't you get me out of trouble and let's get on with the show.
Bar is open.
Bar is open, although I almost hit the end broadcast button instead of hitting the bell because I haven't done this in a while. So
I know.
I forgot.
That callus is worn off your finger.
What is on? I hit it with the palm. What's on tap today,
Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to this this topic and this show. We're here to talk about a book called The Last Hill by Bob Dury and Tom Clavin, and they are authors that you probably have heard of because they've written extensively. And amongst the books that they've worked on are the New York Times bestselling authors of The Heart of Everything That Is, Lucky 666, Halsey's Typhoon, Last Man Out, Valley Forge, and The Last Stand of Fox Company, amongst others. And we're going to be joined this week by Bob. And what we're going to be talking about is, again, the 2nd Ranger Battalion at a place called Hill 400, which not a lot of people know about. And Bob, welcome.
Hey,
thanks for joining us.
How are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bob, but before you jump into the very important topic area,
history stuff,
I've been criticized for underplaying our questions about cocktails. So I do have to ask if you brought with you a beverage for the show today.
I am from my Ed McMahon Memorial Coffee Cup. I am drinking a Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, New Zealand.
Ooh, very nice.
Ooh,
wow, he's classing this up a bit.
I could go get a bourbon if it would make you feel better.
No, any beverage in a pinch. So
it's a question of how good it makes you feel. Because the second half of the show always depends on that.
Well, I do Zooms, especially with COVID, with the last book, Blood and Treasure, what was it, 2.5 years ago? And everything was Zoom. So I found that this coffee cup, that's why I named it the Ed McMahon. Your viewers are probably too young to know what I'm talking about with Ed McMahon. But he was the Carson sidekick who always had a little Irish whiskey in his coffee.
Well, something.
I think our average audience age puts us in good shape on that.
Well,
thanks. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, I was telling Rick I was really excited about this book because, as you know, you and I had spoken, Bob, before the show. It's about the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and it kind of struck close to home for me because I knew Len Lamel, who you write about quite a bit in the book. And one of the things that, you know, when I first met him, like a lot of people, I came to the story of the 2nd Rangers. I was the editor for World War II magazine, and we were talking about Pointe Du Hoc. And so I called up Len Lamel one day, and he was very polite, and he answered my questions. And he said, you know something? When I look back at the war, D-Day was not the worst day. And of course, being new to the story, I was like, what are you talking about? He goes, my worst day was Castle Hill and Hill 400. And so I became very intrigued. So I was thrilled to death that, you know, you've done this book about this completely forgotten about battle. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. But just to sort of get people up to speed, how did you come to this story? And just everybody knows about the 2nd Rangers, but a little bit of background about the 2nd Ranger Battalion before we go into the woods.
Yeah, as you both know, especially for a nonfiction writer, you never know when a story is going to sneak up on you, and a book worthy story is going to sneak up on you and whap you upside the head. I'll give you a perfect example. I was having dinner in Quantico at Marine headquarters. This was years and years ago, with a Marine historian who had helped us so much with our book, The Last Stand of Fox Company, our Korean War book. And I was taking him out to dinner to thank him. And towards the end, we were ordering after dinner drinks and coffee. And he said, well, so what's the next project for you and your co-author, Tom Clavin? I said, we got a few. We're looking at this. We're looking at that. And he said, did you ever hear of the Sioux warrior chief, Red Cloud? And I probably tell from the look on my face that no, I hadn't. And he said, you ought to look into him. He's the only Native American to ever win a war, not a battle, a war against the United States. I looked into it, and because of this offhand comment, Tom and I wrote The Heart of Everything That Is, spent 25 weeks on the New York Times list because a Marine historian had taken an interest in America's 19th century Indian wars. So you never know when something's going to hit you. In this particular case, this was several years back, 2.5, 3. I remember we were putting the finishing touches on Blood and Treasure, our Daniel Boone book. And I was out with a friend of mine here. I live on the Jersey Shore. We're having a beer at a beach cafe with a friend of mine who was a retired lieutenant colonel, Army lieutenant colonel. And he, artillery man. And he said, what's next? And I said, I don't know. We got off the subject, and we were talking about some disaster of the day. I don't know if it was in Iraq, Afghanistan. This was before Ukraine. And all of a sudden he threw up his hands and he said, reminds me of the debacle in the Hurtgen Forest. And I was like, the what now? The who? The what? What forest are you talking about? World War II, Hurtgen Forest. And by the way, I should, as an aside, he's a crusty old artillery man. He did not use the word debacle.
Sure, probably didn't.
I think the phrase he used began with the word cluster.
Charlie Foxtrot.
So I got home that night and I called Tom. I said, I know we have a few things. Maybe we should do some cursory research into what this Hurtgen Forest, this World War II battle of the Hurtgen Forest is all about. I'd never heard of it. And sure enough, we did some research, and it was a wonderful story. I mean, it had everything. It had undying courage from American GIs. It had gore galore. I mean, we were just reviewed somewhere last week, I think in the Times. No, it was maybe the Wall Street Journal, where we got a good review for the last fill, but the reviewer did say, this book is not for the faint of heart or the queasy. There's a lot of gore in this book. And so as we got into it and further and further into it, I said, I pulled off my official U.S. Army War Department history of the Siegfried Line in 1944, the fall, September, October, November. And yes, I am the kind of nerd that does have the official U.S. Army history on my own bookshelf. And I started reading it, and I was like, great stuff, but big but. There's no narrative. There's no through line. And it's a real meat grinder. I mean, we're talking about body parts strewn across the forest floor, 70 square mile forest, the Hurtgen Forest. The pervasive stench of gas gangrene escaping from thousands of dead and dying Germans and GIs. GIs fused together by direct artillery hits. And I'm thinking to myself, well, it's no wonder no one ever, I mean, of course, people have written about the Hurtgen Forest, but it's no wonder I'd never heard about it before. I mean, we have a tendency to jump from D-Day right to the Battle of the Bulge because of the pursuit warfare. We were just chasing the Germans across Europe. And maybe every once in a while you'll get a story about the liberation of Paris. And I'm saying to myself and Tom, I'm saying, it's a good story, Tom, but it's depressing. Who's going to want to? We were getting our asses kicked. We had sent disparate regiments from 4 United States Army divisions into the Hurtgen Forest, into this 70 square mile woodland straddling the Belgian-German frontier. And as the official history was written by the Army's chief historian, Charles MacDonald, as he wrote, we would make 3 feet for every 1 man down. Think about that. 3 feet for every 1 man down. We had sent 50,000 GIs in there. 15,000, almost a third, had come back either dead or wounded, KIA or WIA or MIA. And I said to Tom, I just don't know. Let me read a little further. And I read a little further, and MacDonald had a couple of, almost as an aside, a couple of paragraphs about how this battered Ranger Battalion, by this point down to 400 officers, non-coms, and enlisted men, as a kind of a last resort, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower said, let's send those Rangers in there and see if they can help turn the tide. Unbelievably, they did. Because at the edge, the eastern edge of the Hurtgen Forest, straddling the German-Belgian frontier, was this Hill 400. That's its height in meters, 1,300 feet. And beyond that hill was the German heartland. You crossed the Ruhr, it was a plain to the Rhine. Once you get to the Rhine, you took out the German munitions, you took out their gas. Once you got to the Rhine, the war was essentially over. Eisenhower knew this, and he was hoping to get to the Rhine by the end of the year. That's the whole, you've heard, end the war in 44. Yeah. That was his, let's end this war in 44. He was afraid if the Germans had time to regroup through the fall of 1944, that it might extend the war another 6 to 8 months. He had no doubt we were going to win. By we, I mean the Allies. But he said the concurrent injuries for another 6 to 8 months of fighting, we got to break through somewhere. We're going to break through in the Hurtgen Forest. Hill 400 is the hill we take. From there, it's not literally, but it's metaphorically downhill. Problem was, the Germans could read a map too. They knew how essential Hill 400 was. Because what no Allied military commander knew, and what no S2 intelligence people knew, was that Hitler, of course, had ordered a mass behind the Hurtgen Forest. There was a massive German buildup for a counterattack, scores of divisions, and of course the counterattack became known as the Battle of the Bulge. So the Germans saying, no, we can't. We're surrounded by 5 Allied armies. We cannot let them breach our frontier, or else the Battle of the Bulge is nothing. And so that, to me, made this story a dramatic story, almost a reverse Alamo. The Germans defending the overwhelming force of Germans defending this Hill 400, and 400 400 Rangers take the hill and for a while hold it. So that's what led me into the story.
So we want to come back to the Hurtgen, obviously, because that's really a big focus of your book, and it's also kind of what we want to talk about today. But just to follow up on the other half of Chris's question, I mean, for those, I mean, people are probably familiar with the Rangers at Pointe Du Hoc, possibly familiar with the Rangers in the Brittany Peninsula, but why do the Rangers exist? Okay, the U.S. Army is assembling an army of, I don't know, 7 million men or 10 million or whatever it is. They already have kind of an elite force in the paratroopers, an elite light fighting force. So why did the Rangers even come about? And what is, as Chris said, what is the background kind of on the Rangers taking them up to this battle?
One man, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall. In April of 1942, he was in London to confer with his British counterparts about a cross-channel invasion. And while he was there, Winston Churchill convinced him to set up clandestine units, special forces units, based on Churchill's beloved commandos. Now, this went against pretty much every officer in the United States Army at that time. Wanted nothing to do with special operators. We were still of the mind of Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Potomac. Smash through, smash through, smash through. But this idea of small, mobile, in and out units, it appealed to General Marshall's sense of adventure. And he couldn't be talked out of it. So, and he was the boss. So he assigned one of his most ferocious general officers, Lucian B. Truscott. He said, "There's Lucian B. Look at him." And he said, "I want you to stand up. These Churchill calls them the commandos. Oddly enough, as another aside, it was then Major General Dwight D. Eisenhower, still working at a stateside post in the War Department's planning division, who suggested to Truscott, don't call these Americans commandos. Commandos is a little too British." And he wrote to Truscott, said, "Why don't we call them Rangers?" After Robert Rogers and his Rangers, who 2 centuries earlier had proven such wonderful backwoods fighters in the French and Indian War. And so the Marshall liked the audaciousness of the idea. So he set up several Ranger battalions. And of course, the first 2 and then 3, they entered World War II in North Africa. They were called Darby's Rangers after their commander, William O. Darby. And they did yeoman work behind the lines in North Africa, blowing up the fuel dumps and whatnot of the Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel, the commander of the famed Afrique Corps. And so Marshall's saying, this works. It could work in France. Now, once again, I don't know, Rick, I might have to disagree with your point about everybody knew about the Rangers at Pointe Du Hoc. I'm not quite sure about that. I'm a fairly deep student of American military history, and I wasn't quite sure. I mean, of course, I'm of an age where I grew up on movies like Merrill's Marauders. Jeff Chandler played Frank Merrill. Guerrillas operating in the Burma Theater War in the South Pacific. And I knew about Darby's Rangers probably from a TV show called The Rat Pack, which I remember watching as a little kid in black and white. And they were a thinly veiled version of Darby's Rangers. But I got to thinking after I read McDonald's couple of paragraphs, wait a minute, Rangers? Yeah, I knew about the 101st and the 82nd Airborne, but Rangers, boots on the ground in the European theater of operations? This does not ring a bell with me. And so Tom and I just started following the breadcrumbs. And I think what we do, I love the big man literature, whether it's Patton or Napoleon or Peter the Great or George Washington. I love reading books like that. But that's not what Tom and I write for the most part. We write about ordinary men who rise to extraordinary circumstances. And these Rangers all started out as ordinary men. I mean, bartenders, high school kids, straight out, singing in the choir and playing football in high school. And this is what I think appealed to me. And you mentioned, I'm not sure if it was Chris or Rick who mentioned The Longest Day. For the rest of their lives, these Rangers held a grudge against Cornelius Ryan and his book, The Longest Day, and the movie, The Longest Day, because Ryan and the movie portrayed them as having died for nothing climbing those cliffs at Pointe Du Hoc, when in fact the guns were there, the big 155 howitzers. They were there. They just weren't where they were supposed to be. But the Rangers found them and destroyed them. And Len Lamel who Chris mentioned before, Len Lamel was the one who found them and incapacitated 5 of them. Another Ranger outfit incapacitated the 6th. If these guns had not been incapacitated, if the Rangers had not gone in first on Normandy Beach, these guns had the capacity of driving the Americans back from both Omaha and Utah Beach. And here's a little kind of a tidbit. One of the things that got Tom and I interested in this, contemporaneous writing. I said about ordinary men rising to extraordinary circumstances. Contemporaneous writing is our meat and potatoes. That's what Tom Clavin and I do. I'm talking about journals and diaries and letters home. And when we started digging into the Ranger Battalion Commander, James Earl Rudder's papers at the University of Texas. And Rudder was, he was one of those, he anchored the Texas, there he is. He anchored the Texas A&M line. He was the center for the offensive line for Texas A&M. One of the leather helmet, no face mask kind of guys. I mean, just look at that photo of him. You can kind of tell what kind of guy he was. And in his papers at the University of Texas, of course, we found after action reports, which we use. And but Rudder, Big Jim Rudder, as his men began to call him behind his back, we found that he was an inherent letter writer to his wife, Margaret. Margaret's nickname was Chick. And it was Dear Chick, Dear Chick, Dear Chick. And there was so much personal stuff in these Dear Chick letters. I mean, I felt like calling the book Dear Chick. It wouldn't have worked, but it's a great title for somebody. And we found out that he wanted to put Len Lamel in for the Medal of Honor for Len Lamel's actions atop the cliffs of Pointe Du Hoc at Normandy Beach. And Lamel had talked him out of it. Lamel knew that any recipient of the Medal of Honor, which of course is our military's highest award, is immediately pulled from a combat posting. And the War Department would not risk a Medal of Honor recipient being killed or worse, captured and paraded about by the enemy. So Lamel convinced Rudder, don't put me in for this. Please, I want to fight. I want to stay here. So instead, Lamel received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest honor. So I'm looking, okay, so Rudder's papers, Lee, who's this guy Lamel? I look into him. It turns out he grew up and after the war became an attorney in a community which is maybe 4 towns away from where I live on the Jersey Shore. So I start looking in the library and I find this a retired Army colonel, an amateur historian. He has run a posthumous candidate. Len Lamel died at the age of 91 in 2011, I believe. Yeah. But he ran a posthumous candidacy to have Len Lamel awarded the Medal of Honor, not for Pointe Du Hoc, but for his actions atop Castle Hill, the Hill 400, our last hill. I'm saying, my goodness, there are people who think Len Lamel was Medal of Honor worthy for 2 separate fights. So I find this colonel, the amateur historian. I ask him, meet me for coffee. He walks into the coffee shop with one of those giant briefcases. When he opened it up and pulled out files that thick, I said, oh, we've hit the mother lode. We got the mother lode here. Sure enough, he not only had letters from Lamel's battalion mates attesting to Lamel's heroics, both atop Pointe Du Hoc and Hill 400, but of course in their letters, they describe their own personal reminiscences, whether it was stateside trading when they were stood up in Camp Bedford Forest in Tennessee, whether it was training on the cliffs of Dover in southwest England for Pointe Du Hoc, the Brittany campaign post-invasion, and then, of course, all the way through France and Belgium into the Hurtgen Forest. And I called Tom Clavin that night. I was almost giddy. He said, we get the mother lode here. And he said, yeah, wait till you hear what I got. Turns out that there was another lieutenant. Actually, Len Lamel was a sergeant. By the time he hit Hill 400, he had been field promoted to lieutenant. Lieutenant Bob Edlin, the Fool Lieutenant was his nickname because he volunteered once the 2nd Battalion got overseas to run so many patrols behind enemy lines. And the Fool Lieutenant Bob Edlin had kind of become a surrogate son to James Earl Rudder, Colonel Rudder, over the course of the war. And after the war was over, Rudder exhorted Edlin, put your memories down to paper. people have to remember what you did, what we did. And so Tom found these two elderly sisters in Minnesota who had taken all Edlin's notes and transcribed them and were willing to send the transcription to us. I'm like, this is great. And he said, that's only part of it. Ike Eichner, who was the battalion's comms officer, communications officer. Ike Eichner devoted his post-war life to becoming the unofficial historian of the 2nd Battalion. And Ike Eichner was a pack rat. And before he died, he donated his papers, 6 feet of linear boxes, to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I'm like, Tom, I'll be down in Carlisle tomorrow. And Tom said, wait, I got something else. The battalion's head surgeon, Dr. Walter E. Block, Doc Block, of course they called him. Tom had found Doc Block's only living son outside of Chicago. And Jeffrey Block, the son, he had his father's combat diary, handwritten. And he said, I'd be willing to Xerox and send it to you guys. So from there, the floodgates just opened. We found memoirs that several of these Rangers had written post-war, right after the war, never published or self-published. And I even found kind of an Eye's own diary. It was not a unit diary. It was an Eye's own that 3 Rangers had kept, put together as kind of a book, a pamphlet after the war. It was lewd. It was ribald. It's the type of stuff that the Army was not going to put out there, but we found that. And after that, what I'm telling you about here, I may have gone off track. I'm sorry if I have, but this is the contemporaneous writings that Tom and I feel make a narrative. They may, not that official after action reports or the gazillions of autobiographies and biographies of World War II or the histories, not that they don't inform our books, or in this case, they don't inform The Last Hill, but it's this personal stuff that we really feel brings our story to life. And these guys were a bunch of literate fellas, and I thank them all for that.
Well, so picking up on that, Bob, one of the things you obviously really highlight in the book, and you do such a wonderful job of it. Could you tell people a little bit more about these different personalities and what sort of people were they? What did it take to become a Ranger? Right? It's not you don't just show up and say, "Hey, I'm a Ranger." Right? What's involved? And what sort of people are they attracting to this unit?
Well, it continued all through England, but I'll just say, when Colonel Rudder was tasked with standing up this outfit in Tennessee, he brought in as many people a day as volunteers as he culled. He had an idea of what a Ranger should be and should look like. Truscott had originally, his motto was speed, stealth, and violence. And that was, Rudder agreed to that, but he also wanted people who could think for themselves. And I'll give you an example. The comms officer I mentioned, or did I mention James Eichner, Lieutenant James Eichner? Eichner, they called him. Before Rudder got there, he had been a nascent Ranger, and he had served under a string of kind of ineffective officers. And Ike Eichner took it on himself to do one example. He had been a telephone lineman before the war. And when the Rangers were treated like a second-class citizens at Camp Bedford Forest in Tennessee. They were issued field telephones, but only receivers and no wire. So Eichner, who had been a telephone lineman, he led a midnight raid to cut down telephone wire around the camp so the Rangers could use their field telephones. Now, there was still a 2-month investigation who did this going on when Rudder arrived. Eichner kind of took the sense of Rudder. Okay, this is the man. And he said, I better confess. And he went and he said, Colonel, you may have heard they're looking for the man who stole the telephone wire. That would be me. And he explained why. And Rudder gave Eichner kind of a mild dressing down. But that night he wrote to his wife, Dear Chick, this is the kind of man, individual thinking. This is the kind of guy I want in not only a man that can not collapse after an 80-mile speed march with full pack, but a man who thinks for himself. Rudder continued that. When they got to England, every morning they're training on the cliffs of Dover. 2 or 3 rangers, sometimes 4, would be pulled aside, and they would be given maps. And there would be a city in Scotland, in Wales, or a town or a hamlet in Scotland, Wales, or England. And he would say, depending how far away it was, he said, you have X amount of time to get there. Grab something that will prove to me you were there and get back here. All the while he was training these men not only to be the most physically fit outfit in the U.S. Army, but in case a private had to take over a platoon, in case a corporal had to take over a company, in case he wanted men who thought for themselves. And I guess to answer your question, I would never denigrate any World War II unit of the U.S. Army, but Rudder wanted his men, and so did Darby in North Africa, wanted his men to be a step above both mentally, physically, and here's something the Army doesn't usually promote, emotionally. He wanted them to be able to handle the troughs as well as the highs, because he knew there were going to be troughs, and there certainly were, both at Normandy Beach, both in Normandy Beach and Brittany, and certainly in the Hurtgen Forest.
You know, we should we want to kind of turn our attention to the Hurtgen Forest, and you know, you have a great quote in the book, and you touched on this earlier. Quote toward the end of the book from Army historian Charles MacDonald, who himself was a company commander during the war, who basically says that most historians, or many historians, skip over anything that happened from about September 11th to December 15th, the day before the Battle of the Bulge, and give it a paragraph or two. You've got this tremendously violent fight in the Hurtgen Forest that goes on. So why is there fighting there? What's the point of the fighting there? And why? What makes it sort of so much, I think it seems almost like more awful than any other fighting, but what makes it so awful? Why is it happening? What makes it so awful?
Well, some people would say it was a mistake. Eisenhower, as I mentioned before, wanted to break through. He wanted to break over the German border and into the heart of Germany before the end of 1944. Now, Patton is the logical man to be the tip of this spear. But Patton is stalled to the south. He's out of gasoline. Montgomery, the Field Marshal Montgomery, the British Field Marshal, he and Eisenhower did not get along, but Eisenhower was a smart thinker, and he would have liked to have given the job to Montgomery, because he knew London was being saturated with V1 and V2 rockets, and he said this will be an uplift for the Brits. But Montgomery had failed to break through the Siegfried Line and the Netherlands. So that left the First Army. And the First Army, what was between the First Army and Germany? The Hurtgen Forest. Now, the commander of the First Army was advised by several other commanders, go around it. Go around it.
That's Courtney Hodges, right?
Yeah, Courtney Hodges. Get over the Ruhr and get to the Rhine. But Hodges was a stubborn man, and he said, no, I'm going to break through here. I'm going to break through Aachen, the first German city to fall north of the Hurtgen Forest. There it is. Is Aachen on that map?
It is. It's right at where the different parts of the Siegfried Line come together.
Yeah. Aachen had already fallen, and people said to him, either the Monschau corridor south of the Hurtgen Forest or the Aachen corridor north of the Hurtgen Forest, that should be your line of attack. But Courtney Hodges, was afraid that he would be flanked by the German troops in the Hurtgen Forest. And he said, no, I got to take this forest first. So that was his decision. To this day, historians argue whether it was wrong, stupid, or imbecilic. Nobody really thinks it was right. But nonetheless, for the 50,000 GIs that were sent in that forest, none of them were wrong, stupid, or imbecilic. They were just doing their job. So that's the kind of setup to the Hurtgen Forest. And I think there was a second part to your question, which my Rancott from Marlborough, New Zealand, has led me to forget.
Well, I'll let Chris jump in. Go ahead.
Well, no, I think it's important that people know maybe a little bit more about the forest. I mean, the Germans called it the Green Hell.
Grünhelle.
Right. And Hemingway calls it Passchendaele with tree bursts.
Right.
What are what are the surroundings that make this place so unique and so difficult to even walk through, let alone fight through? I think
it was continually dark. It was 100-foot. There you go, 100-foot. Now you see some of them are have been taken out by artillery, but stacked with 100-foot conifers with pines. So even at high noon, it looked a bit like dusk. The forest floor was laced with mines. The hundreds of hidden bunkers with there you go, with and that you can see. But the way the Germans had disguised those bunkers with pine boughs and down pine trees, you could be 3 feet from a bunker, a platoon or a patrol, and suddenly a German 50 cal would open up and you'd all be dead. And so the GIs walking into the Hurtgen, and it had snowed for the entire month of November. There had been sunshine one day, and it either snowed or rained. So it's either frozen, or they have to dig their foxholes with TNT. They're using dynamite, C4. They're using to dig their foxholes, or else it is mud up to the fenders of Jeeps, and they're pushing their Jeeps through. The few forest roads, the Germans had cut down trees to stop, because the Allies, of course, had the two Allied superiority air. I'm losing the word. Air support, yeah. Close air support, and artillery were negated in the Hurtgen Forest because the weather for 30 straight days, it was cloud cover. So all the airports, takeoff places we had liberated in Belgium were of no use to us because we couldn't get planes in the air, and we couldn't get our tanks in there. So it was a slog. It was almost Hill 400, our last hill. The Germans called it Bergberg, and because there had been, that means Castle Hill. There had been an old medieval Schloss, German castle, at the top of that hill. Now Napoleon's artillery had taken out most of that. And what made me think of that is because we're almost back to the age of Napoleon in the Hurtgen Forest in 1944, with soldiers just slogging through this muck, and this you can barely see. And the Germans had perfected tree burst artillery, which means that you're used to seeing a shell land and create a crater. They had perfected, and they had outlined it. They had spotters. They had years to spot. And they said, if we tree burst here, in other words, if our shells land at the top of this clump of trees, not only will it rain iron from the shells on the Ammies, that's what they call the Americans, the Ammies, but it'll rain these lethal wooden shards. I remember one ranger, he wrote, when he first got into the forest, he thought that all the dead GIs he was seeing, he thought they had been speared by medieval pikemen. There was so much wood sticking out of them. So I hope that sets up the.
Yeah.
I mean, it was right. It's out of the imagination of the Brothers Grimm, with more blood, a lot more blood.
Yeah. So, Hill 400 is the last hill of your book, which, just to remind people of that book, it's The Last Hill by Bob Dury and Tom Clavin, and Bob Dury is here with us today. So what makes Hill 400 so important, and why is it that with all the people, divisions, etc., in the Hurtgen, that a few hundred Rangers get the job of taking it?
Well, first of all, Hill 400 sits on the eastern edge of the forest, the woodland. And from that 1,300-foot height, German artillery spotters can see nearly the entire 70 square mile Hurtgen Forest. So there's spotters up there, and we think, they're throwing shells up. No, they had these state-of-the-art nice, I'm not sure how to say the word in German, GENISS, nice, I think, sites that were better than any artillery sites we had, the Allies had. They could see a man moving 12 miles away, and they would throw mortar at him. One man. We're not talking patrol. We're not talking about a platoon. We're not talking about a company. So we're getting wiped out with this. So people say, we can't get through the Hurtgen Forest. We might be able to avoid some of the towns. Schmidt was a big town, a crossroads in the Hurtgen Forest, which didn't fall till February of 1945. But we can't avoid, if we're going to get through the Hurtgen Forest and penetrate into Germany, we have to take this last hill, this Hill 400. And so, once again, it was the speed, the in and out, the clandestine, the officers, the Allied officers used to this pound ahead, pound ahead, pound ahead. It just didn't work in the Hurtgen. But the stealthiness of the Rangers, they had been trained. They had been trained to go around obstacles as opposed to going through obstacles. And I think that's why these 400 men, or actually 400 men started out. 400 men did not walk out. 400 Rangers did not walk out of the Hurtgen Forest, but 400 Rangers walked in. I know that's why they succeeded, where portions of 50,000 GIs before them had not.
So what was the condition of the Ranger Battalion when they went into the Hurtgen? Because not only are they given this, quite frankly, impossible mission, but right at the last moment before they go into the attack on this hill, something significant happens to the battalion. So maybe, kind of set up what the condition of the unit is when they get there and what happens to them right before the attack even begins.
Well, first of all, they were angry. They were angry that when they were first deployed into the Hurtgen, they were not deployed as an offensive force. They had been trained to take the cliffs of Pointe Du Hoc on D-Day. They had been trained to take the Locris battery. They had been trained offense, offense, offense. We move forward. And Courtney Hodges, the general, the First Army general, he was using them as a defensive force. He was putting them in foxholes and saying, don't let the Germans overrun us. They didn't like that. So finally they get the word. We're going to send you, you're going to be the tip. You're going to be in charge of taking this hill. And the night before it happens, or the day before it happens, Colonel Rudder is called back to Belgium. And it's only a 6-hour ride. And they're getting the word and they're ready to go. Where's Rudder? Where's Rudder? Rudder finally comes back and he said, I've just been handed a regiment. Which is he deserved this. He was commanding a battalion, now he's commanding a regiment. But the Rangers, who had fled and fought and cried and blood, sweat, and tears with this colonel, they're like, what? The night before, we're to take Hill 400, the last hill? You're not going to be with us? And he said, I tried. I talked my best, but Eisenhower wants me back. He wants me back leading this regiment in Belgium. And as it turns out, I don't want to give too much away, but as it turns out, it was a good thing he does because he played a role in the Battle of the Bulge. Mm-hmm. But that kind of was a body blow. It was a body blow to the Rangers. But on the other hand, Rudder had taught them well. All those, all those think for yourselves. Yes, it was a body blow for an hour or so when Rudder stood in the snowy rain in the middle of the road and shook every man's hand goodbye. But then again, he had trained them to think for themselves and to act for themselves. And so his officers stepped up and the job was done. I mean, when we get towards the end of this interview, I was just going to say something right now, but we'll wait till we get towards the end of this interview. Ask me to kind of wrap it up and I'll wrap it up for you.
Okay.
I'm not hearing you, Rick. Can you hear me?
He does this once a show.
There
you go.
Chris, you're the one who's knowledgeable about this battle. You've been there. I'm going to cede the floor to you here.
Well done. So, all right. So, Bob, they've had this body blow. Without giving too much away, tell us a little bit about what they're doing to get on top of this hill and hold it after several division-size units have tried and failed. What is their method? How are they getting up there to take that ground?
All right, I'll show you. If you put up that small map again.
Yeah, I'll find it. Yep.
Oh, okay. All right. So
talk amongst yourselves.
There you go. So They fight their way through. They leave Colonel Rudder at Kleinau. You see Kleinau at the top there.
Yeah.
They fight their way through Brandenburg, which has already been taken, but there's still German presence there, and they make their way into Bergstein, which is just a hellhole. Remember the opening scene in Blade Runner? That's what Bergstein looks like, except for dead bodies all over the place. So the GIs are hunkered down in Bergstein. The Rangers fight through Bergstein because the Germans control the eastern end of the town, and they get to the base of Hill 400. And I think you can see it there. So half the battalion, what's left of the battalion, 400 men, they spread out to the northwest and the southwest to prevent German counterattacks, which you see by the red arrows there, but also to provide covering fire for the 130 Rangers who are going to attempt to take Hill 400. And I have to look at my map, my own map here, and I got it. Okay, yeah. So the Germans control the western slope of Hill 400. They control the eastern slope of Hill 400, and see the Rohr River there? There are German artillery battalions on either side to the north and the south of the Rohr, which are just going to pound the hell out of any American force, any AMI force trying to take it. So on the morning of December 6th, 1944, 3 months we've been trying to take this damn hill. September, October, November. The morning of December 6th, Chris, was it you, Rick? I can't remember who mentioned Len Lamel, but it was Chris. It was Len Lamel who his quote was, "Some people say June 6, 1944 was the longest day of World War II. For me, December 6, 1944 was the longest day of World War II." So on that morning of December 6, 1944, as about half of what's left of the Ranger Battalion spreads out to provide covering fire, 130 men line up to ascend this hill. They have to cross a field, an open field where they can be seen. There's no cover. There it is. There's the open field. And they climb the hill. The playground slide I described before, 45 degrees. It's that looks really nice, but at the time it was snowy and icy, and it was just hell as German riflemen and machine gunners are pouring bullets down the western slope. Potato mashers are rolling down. It was hell. Grüne Helle, green hell. Of those 130 men, 100 make it to the top. Hand-to-hand fighting by this point. Neither the Germans nor the Americans have had a time to reload. They've emptied their weapons. They're fighting with trench knives. They're killing each other with their helmets. They're fighting with their entrenching tools. The Americans managed to scratch out a small perimeter around the bunker that the German artillery spotters were using. And they're piling their dead into one half of the bunker. It's a morgue. They're piling their wounded into the other half of the bunker. It's an aid station. And they've survived through that day and night. They survive 4 or 5 counterattacks. And in between, I showed you before, from north and south, the Germans are just bombarding the hill with artillery. I mean, they knew what this meant. They knew if the Americans break through here, the Battle of the Bulge, or the counterattack, was in danger. And in fact, it was Himmler, head of the SS. He had promised any unit that can retake Hill 400. First of all, he was shocked that they lost Hill 400. He said, any unit that retakes Hill 400, every man in that unit gets an Iron Cross first class. So the Germans were just clawing back trying to take this hill. And as they are doing it, the American perimeter is shrinking and shrinking, and their numbers are going down. They held it for the day, all night. The next morning, they're down. The 100 men who made it to the top has been halved. They're down to 50 men, 50 effectives are wounded. By noon, they're down to 30 something. Early in the afternoon, Len Lamel, Sergeant Len Lamel from Normandy Beach, who has been now field promoted to Lieutenant Len Lamel, he's the last officer standing atop Hill 400. His several of his fingers, his pinky, his thumb, they're hanging by their ligaments from bomb fragments. He's bleeding from his ears, from his nose. He's bleeding out of his anus, but he didn't let anybody know from bomb concussions. He does a head count, and he counts 20, and they've not been reinforced, the Rangers, and he counts 22 Rangers still standing. And these included several wounded men who had crawled out of the aid station and decided, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on the line. And and now the perimeter is just tiny. It's a tiny little perimeter around that bunker that the Germans had used as spotters and the Americans had turned into an aid station. And he calls the 4 non-coms who are still standing, staff sergeant, a platoon sergeant, and 2 regular sergeants. And Lamel says to them, I know, I'm well aware that the United States Army is not a democracy. But in this one case, I'm going to make an exception. All our officers are either in that aid station or dead. I'm the last one standing, and it's my order that we take a vote to retreat off this hill. We go back down the east slope, gather the rest of our Ranger Battalion, and we retake this hill. Perhaps the Germans are not the Japanese. They won't kill our wounded. Our dead are dead. We will bury them with honors when we get back up here. Or you can look down there, and then they could all see on the east, on the bottom of the east base of the hill, the German infantry were not only reforming to counterattack sixth time, but they had been reinforced by and I'm not sure how to say the word, my German, Fallschirmjäger. These elite German paratroopers had joined them. And Lamel said, this is what we're up against. So we're going to take a vote, and I'm going to stand by that vote. And he went around and he said, Sergeant, 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 Sergeant. And Lamel voted himself. Now, vote was, well, if you want to know what that vote was, you're going to have to read the damn book.
Read the book. Yeah, right. Well played, Bob. Well played.
Right. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, no. So it's obviously an amazing story, and with many people whose actions are quite extraordinary. It's sort of one person, just to pick one person out who isn't even a Ranger, who plays a great role in this.
Yes.
There's a guy named Howard Kettlehut, and tell us just a little. We're getting towards the end, and we want to ask you a wrap-up question after this. But tell us a little bit about Howard Kettlehut.
Howard Kettlehut had been assigned to the Rangers. Look at him with the thin nose. I mean, and the Rangers was like, and he was artillery coordinator. And they had, what's the number? You probably know it better than I do. There was 21 Allied artillery emplacements, everything from howitzers to mortars, who were going to support this Ranger. And Howard Kettlehut went right in, knew not a single Ranger. At first, they looked at him, and that photo doesn't really show up. It was a skinny little guy, and they're like, what's this guy doing? Howard Kettlehut turned out he was the maestro of landing artillery. He could call in artillery so it would chase German troops into Ranger ambushes. And afterwards, they said he was the best non-Ranger we ever worked with. I mean, we could go on all night here. I mean, there's one of my favorite characters, Herman Bubby Stein, a New Yorker in the Rangers. In fact, he proved there he is. He proved so adept at climbing that some of the Rangers, when they were still back in Tennessee, they wondered if this guy had been a second story man for the Jewish mafia back in New York. I mean, he scampered up Pointe Du Hoc on Normandy, and he got almost all the way up when his Mae West life preserver inflated. He almost got knocked back down. And then 40 years later, at a commemorative ceremony, the French government had invited some Rangers over. He's in his mid-60s. He does it again. He does it again. I mean, we talked about Len Lamell. We talked about Bob. There's so many. Harold the Duke Slater, the commanding officer of Fox Company. I mean, the Duke, even his name swagger. He had been blown off his LST, his landing craft, 300 yards, maybe half mile off the Normandy beach. And the water was freezing that day. And about a week later, they're all going through the barracks bags of, they've broken through to Normandy. The Rangers have bivouacked in France, a few miles. The ritual is you go through the barracks bag and you refold everything and you send it all back to, these are the dead Rangers belongings. You send it back to mom and dad, maybe a wife back in the States. But first you check. You make sure there's no pinup girls. You make sure there's no condoms. You make sure there's no deck of cards with risque pictures. And in the Duke's barracks bag, they found an unopened bottle of White Horse Scotch. So of course they opened it and they passed it around Fox Company. And everybody took a swig, and this is for the Duke. 12 days later, when the Duke shows up after having been floating in the frigid English Channel for 12 hours, he's treated for hypothermia. He shows up 12 days later, and he's like, "Hey, where's my Scotch?" People are like, "Well, I got a patrol I got to run to. I got to do this. Sorry." I mean, there's so many characters. We could go on all night. I'll tell you, one of my favorite, Elrod Petty. Elrod Petty is he's a good old boy from the piney woods, the red dirt, southern Georgia. And there he is. Now, look at his face. Now, see his face? You can't tell there, but you can kind of tell by his pinched cheeks. Elrod Petty, he had been a fighter. He had been a football player. He had no front teeth, top or bottom. The Army, of course, had issued him dentures, but he just said, they're uncomfortable. I don't like them. I can't wear them. And Rudder, who had a thing, he was kind of a stickler for the cut of a man's jib, that kind of thing. And Rudder would go to Elrod Petty's company officers, platoon officers, says, I want to transfer this guy out. He just doesn't look like a squared away Ranger to me with no teeth and no sunken. It just doesn't fit my image of a Ranger. And every officer would say, he's our best. And Elrod Petty would go on to become the heart and soul of Fox Company. But they say, he's our best. He is our best BAR man, Browning automatic rifle. He belongs here, Colonel Rudder. He belongs here. But finally, Rudder one day just said he'd seen Petty, and he said, "Son, come into my office. I have to talk to you." And he said, I know you have been trying hard, but I'm going to transfer you back to your old outfit. And Petty said to him, "Sir, Colonel Rudder, may I make my case?" And Rudder went, "Sure." And Elrod Petty saying, "I grew up in a broken home. My father beat me. The Rangers have become my family. I love the Rangers. I want to fight for the Rangers. I want to be a Ranger." And I think it was his last sentence that changed Rudder's mind, because he looked at me and said, "Plus, in the end, Colonel Rudder," he went, showed his gums. He goes, "I ain't planning on biting no Nazis to death." We could go on. We could talk about these guys all night,
But we just have a moment or two left. But Chris, go ahead, give us a
I was
last
gonna
question
say
here.
no. But we're gonna. My last question was going to be, what is the legacy of this battle to the war and to the Rangers? And hopefully that's a broad enough question that you can wrap this up.
Rangers lead the way.
Rangers lead the way.
That was a Normandy Beach thing, but it's funny. Chris, I don't think there is a legacy, because this battle of the Hurtgen Forest was so washed over, as we said in the very beginning. Historians, writers, popular military history writers like Tom and I, or Hampton Sides, or S.C. Gwant, anybody who writes about World War II wanted to jump from D-Day to the Battle of the Bulge. Now, maybe a little in between, the liberation of Paris, but it was all pursuit warfare. That's the official U.S. Army term for it, as we chased the Germans back east across Europe. And I think the legacy, if there is one, would be that Rangers and special operators in general, this was the beginning of the wars we fight today. I mentioned when we were off air that I had been a war correspondent for 20 years, Afghanistan and Iraq, Sarajevo, Darfur. I mean, hellholes all over the world. We fight our wars now with special operators.
Mm.
And the Rangers, if in fact that 2nd Ranger Battalion, and of course it's remembered inside the U.S. military, that might have been the spur. I'm speculating here, but that might have been the spur for the way we fight today with SEALs and Marine Recon, and of course Rangers and pararescue jumpers in the Air Force, combat control operators in the Air Force. That might have led from in a very crooked road, but that might have led from fall of 1944 to 2022 in our Army today, and our armed forces today, I should say.
Yeah.
Bob Dury, thank you so much for joining us
Thank you,
today.
Bob.
Just a tremendous conversation. Saw a lot of positive comments from people in our comments pane. A reminder to everyone that the book by Bob Dury and Tom Clavin is The Last Hill, the epic story of a Ranger Battalion and the battle that defined World War II. And so, Bob, I don't know what your next book is, but, give us a call when you got one. We'd love to have you back on.
I'm working on it already, but I'll keep it under. Once
Keep
again,
it under wraps. Keep it under wraps.
You never know. I'm going to have a beer with somebody who's going to give me a better one. So,
all right. Thank you so much. Thanks, care.
Rob.
Okay, next week,
Next week,
one more encore episode.
Yeah, well, I'll actually be home. Where are you going to be?
I will be flying back from Key West.
Key West. Oh, okay. Just checking.
So I'll think of you.
I'm sure you will. Yeah.
I'll think of you. One more.
Oh, by the way, when you are in Key West,
Yeah.
just something to do in between things.
Yeah.
You need to practice your accents because they're a little.
I did one.
Well, no, you did.
Last week. That was last
you
week.
did one, and then you tried to do. Then you tried to do like a pirate thing, which just wasn't. No.
That is so last week. You're getting
Well,
lost in the history of our show.
I
here.
think you're splitting
Stay
hairs.
with
You're
us
trying
in
to divert from what the real issue is.
Stay with us in the present.
Okay.
One more encore episode, appropriate enough and you're making it really hard for me to intro into this. As we approach the holiday, we will replay our interview with Peter Harmson, who is the author of The Darkest Christmas,
yeah.
December 1942, A World at War. So pay no attention to the humorous remarks that my co-host is making because it's a serious subject. It was a great interview, and we're glad to bring it back to you. 82 years after that Christmas, as we approach this Christmas. And Chris, we should take a moment as we end our show today to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays,
et cetera.
Yeah, all that good stuff. And as a last word, I'll just say, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on X, listen to our podcast, and back us on patreon.com, and browse History Happy Hour.
And nothing says Christmas more
than a contribution.
That's right. The
Grinch would hate you, but the rest of us will love you.
We'll really appreciate it. Yes. Thanks, everybody. Merry Christmas. Stay safe.